Good afternoon and welcome everyone. So my name is James Plunkett and I'm a writer and consultant helping organisations to adopt more contemporary and human ways of doing things. Today I have the real pleasure of hosting a conversation on behalf of my former colleagues at Nesta on the craft of mission-driven government. I'll just give a couple of minutes of background to the report that we're launching today, which goes back about a year or 18 months or so. At a time when there was lots of talk around mission-driven government, mission-driven ways of working, particularly in the UK, with an incoming Labour government that had committed to 5 grand missions. And we felt at the time that there was not so much out there in terms of granular ways to help people assess whether they were truly mission-driven as organisations. How do you go about assessing your maturity to be a mission-driven organisation? And I was having lots of conversations at the time with folk in government, both before and after the election, asking those kinds of questions. Are we doing it right? What does it look like to be mission driven? And so we wanted to produce something that could help people answer those questions, not just in government, but in any organisation. And we reached out at Nesta to colleagues at the Better Government Lab at Georgetown, and together we developed a maturity framework, a kind of self-assessment tool for assessing whether your organisation is set up to be mission-driven. This is all now live in the world, and we'll share links in the chat as we go through. There's a long report and also an accompanying slide deck, which gives a much shorter and more visual summary of the framework for people to use. So that's the background to today's conversation. I'll just introduce our speakers. We have a fantastic lineup to discuss the framework and to really dig into the content. That includes 2 co-authors of the framework. So Vinuri Dissanayake, who holds a master's in public policy from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Vinuri's worked in various roles advising public sector organisations, including as a research assistant in the Better Government Lab. And Dan Honig, who is Associate Professor of Public Policy at UCL in London, and also Associate Professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Dan also has a wonderful book I recommend called Mission-Driven Bureaucrats, which unpacks many of these questions around purpose-driven management practices. We also have Isadora Chappell, who is a consultant at Inner Circle Consulting, working on public service transformation, particularly in places. I first came across Isadora's work when she gave a wonderful talk at a Transform Gov meetup in the UK on her work measuring capabilities in government as part of Mariana Mazzucato's team at the IIPP at UCL. So hopefully we'll dig into that question of government capability as we get into conversation later. Just a couple of words very briefly on housekeeping. So these events are always much more a conversation than a sort of broadcast. So as we go through, do jump into the comments on the right of your screens, add comments, add questions, and we will open up into a sort of wider discussion later on. Closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream, if that's useful to you. We'll start though by just grounding the conversation in the maturity framework itself. So I think I'll turn to Vinuri just to talk us through some of the headlines from the framework before we open up into conversation. So over to you, Vinuri.
Thank you, James, and it's a pleasure to be here and speaking to all of you. As James kind of mentioned, there is a growing aspiration to being mission-driven, but a struggle to put that mission into practice. And so closing this gap is really been the intent of our developing this maturity framework. Hannah, do you mind just bringing up thank you so much. And you can move to the next one. And as we were developing it, our goal was really to develop a practical tool to help, decision makers such as yourself self-reflect on where they are and prioritize what it takes to go further in terms of mission-driven alignment. And as we deep dive into the framework just a little bit, we wanted to be clear in terms of a few things. One is that it is by no means a blueprint, and it's not a tool for policing. The way we kind of conceptualize it is it's there to act more as a compass to kind of guide honest conversations that you might be having, to direct learning, and really to gauge progress. Moving on to the next one. To start with, our maturity framework really distinguishes between 2 levels of missions, organizational as well as grant missions. Organizational missions kind of focus on a specific purpose, like a hospital improving patient well-being and outcomes. In contrast, grand missions, as what we have here in the UK, are broader. They're system-wide goals. They're grand societal challenges, such as achieving net zero. In the process of developing this framework and kind of seeing the comparison of the two, what we found is that they're actually not competing ideas. In fact, if you do them well, they're actually mutually reinforcing. Next. And despite their differences, both organizational and grand missions can actually be assessed along the same axes. It requires us to ask two very simple questions. Firstly, are we implementing the processes and practices to be more mission aligned? And secondly, has the outcomes and behaviors that we're now seeing indicate a culture driven by mission-driven alignment? So moving on, part one of our maturity framework explores these questions in the context of at the organizational level. Next, thank you, Hannah. And next. In organizations, mission-aligned practices can be embedded within 6 domains, as you can see. They range from leadership and the rituals that they can use to actually foreground the organization's sense of purpose. And it can also range to exploring the very hierarchy and organizational structure of an entity. In reality, these domains actually overlap, but considering them separately actually allows us to zero in and understand the different levers and indicators we should be seeing and pulling in order to be more mission aligned. Next. For example, and to kind of bring this to life a little bit more, if you're, say, an education nonprofit that is looking to understand their mission maturity, you will actually review processes and indicators across all of the domains that you saw. But in the people domain, what you may find is that you do, in fact, as an organization, offer your entire staff an opportunity to interact with their core beneficiaries in a team day. But what you may then find is that you actually rarely integrate mission point conversations as part of your feedback culture. This is about creating a strength-based conversation around what you're doing well in the organization and what are the missed opportunities in terms of what you could explore better. Next. Having determined whether the right processes have been embedded, we then consider whether that has been translated into the outcomes and behaviors that you want to see that show tangible connection to a mission. This can be measured, for example, through an employee engagement survey. Each domain has its own medium-term outcomes, but they all ultimately contribute towards a shared set of long-term outcomes across the organization to show whether a mission-driven culture is actually cultivating. Next. And based on what you learn from your exploration of the processes embedded and the behaviors that you're seeing, you will land in one of 4 quadrants that kind of represent what we call a mission archetype. From a mission-driven organization where you've embedded both the processes and you're cultivating the right behaviors, to a mission-washed organization where you're actually doing neither. These archetypes are really intended to kind of show an organization at a point in time how they're going and to then guide their progress towards a more mission-aligned organization. Next. Having explored organizations at the missions at the organizational level, we then move to part 2 of our framework, which is exploring it at the grand mission level, which is critical here in the UK given the agenda. And what's important to note is that grand missions are very different, but they actually share some common attributes in that they're cross-cutting, they're complex, they're uncertain, and they're broad. As such, they do require a very different set of processes and tools to what we would do to agitate mission-driven culture at the organizational level. However, we can still assess their maturity using the same axes of processes and behaviors. Next. Assessing maturity for a grand mission in its processes require a different set of domains. Firstly, we look at whether the mission is actually well set up, and it requires us to investigate, is there a clear vision and target? Is there a game plan in place? We then need to examine whether a government or a lead organization that's trying to drive this grand mission is actually pulling a few levers, including, are they driving innovation? Are they cultivating and harnessing intelligence around this grand mission? And ultimately, are they pulling the right levers to shape and reshape the system? Moving on. To deep dive into one domain to illustrate, a lead organization, such as the UK government here, can look to, say, build a national health service that's fit for the future. And in order to do that, they need to drive innovation. Two tools or processes that might be telling of this include prototyping and experimenting. For example, in the US, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement uses the Plan, Do, Study Act cycle to actually test new ideas in real healthcare settings. So a lead organization, by taking a domain by domain review, can actually see the tools that are being utilized to kind of move out of inertia and actually agitate the system, as well as the missed opportunities of the tools that they could better be pulling and utilizing in order to create change. Moving on. Having seen whether the right tools and processes are being used to create this grand mission change, a lead organization needs to then see, are they diffusing the right behaviors at a system-wide level, starting from that lead organization? And this requires us to ask some telling questions, because obviously it's more difficult in the system-wide context than in the organizational one to see if the behaviors are actually being cultivated. So to illustrate, in the driving innovation component, you could ask yourself, are practitioners that are working on this grand mission actually sharing insights about what works or not? Another question is, do people seem motivated to address uncertainties that could actually be hindering the grand mission initiative? Understanding this offers that self-reflection mechanism to allow the kind of lead organization to see what's happening in the system, what are people saying, and what actually is creating the inertia. Moving on. Having determined this score, the lead organization can then map itself on the grand mission matrix, which looks very similar to the organizational matrix. Again, neither representation is a static one, and it's not meant to be a self-actualizing identity for any grand mission or organizational mission. Rather, it's a sense check that allows a grand mission and a lead organization to sense where they're falling, where they could be backsliding into, and where they should be moving towards, which is ultimately being more mission-driven. Next. In synthesis, and kind of trying to bring a rather inconvenient or convenient bow around it all, there are some key takeaways to highlight. Firstly, whether you're here trying to solve a grand mission or trying to practice an organizational mission in the day-to-day, grand missions and organizational missions are intended to kind of marry together and work together, because a grand mission allows organizational missions a frontier through which to agitate positive change, while strong organizational missions can actually be the fuel that a grand mission needs to move forward. It's also important to be cognizant that an overall mission maturity, or the archetype you receive, while important, is not as important or equally as important as looking at the specific domains in which you're also working. So understanding your maturity in the people domain or in driving innovation gives you a clear sense of how and what levers you should be better pulling to create positive change in terms of mission alignment. Finally, measuring mission maturity should not be a one-off. It should be a regular practice. And where you find yourself and what you're learning about yourself at a particular point in time is important, but the direction you intend to travel in is potentially more important. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mary. That's a really wonderful overview. And I think it hopefully brings out what we tried to achieve with the framework of really getting quite granular and practical for people, as you say, to dive deep into a domain and kind of get beyond the abstraction of are you mission driven to the practicalities. I wonder if I can just start with a quick follow-up to you and ask how your views changed. I know we had lots of debates in the course of developing the framework. How did your views change about being mission driven over the course of that process?
I think they changed quite drastically, to be honest, James. I think there were a lot of assumptions that we started off with that we really had to test and challenge our thinking with. And one of the key ones actually was that delineation between organizational missions and grand missions. I think, when we first started out, James, many months and almost years ago now, we tried to kind of fit a square peg in a round hole and force ourselves to kind of treat them the same and explore them in the same way. But the more we tried to understand the tools and the processes that we need to actually create change in both of those spheres, we realized that, while they do actually assist each other, they require a very different set of expertise and a very different kind of focus. And that really created a lot of clarity in the delineation of our maturity framework and how we addressed both in terms of the effort we put into understanding one and understanding to bridge the gap between the two as well.
Right. Yeah, I think my mind changed on the same point, I think, throughout the process. I wonder if I can bring in Dan as well and just sort of zoom out a bit. There's a lot in the framework. It's a very detailed document. Encourage people to dive into it. But I wonder what's the sort of single most important takeaway for you if you were to say to folk, here's the thing to have front of mind if you're assessing whether you're mission driven. How would you sum that up?
Yeah, so I guess first, just the premise of that question, that you can in fact do that you can assess if you're working on missions, right? So I think sometimes in the discourse it sounds as if I'm working on missions, as long as I use the word, I'm doing something. But of course, old wine and new bottles taste the same, right? And in that sense, just the fact that you can do that. And to me, the center of kind of what you should keep front and center is in some ways building on what you were both just talking about. What holds that square peg and that round peg into the same array, which is at core this idea that if we're working on missions at any level, we're coping with uncertainty. We're coping with the fact that we cannot monitor and blueprint our way to success. We need new structures, maybe. We need new discovery. We need information from different sources. And thus, at core, the question is, are our organizations transitioning in ways that allow us to figure those things out, to bring those things up? I wonder, James, what your answer to the same question would be. And I should say, you said we a moment ago, but of course, we're here not just with two co-authors, but with three, in the sense that you also were a huge contributor to this report. If I could ask you to take off your host hat for a moment, what would you say to the same question?
Yeah, I think, in a way, the big thing is just how demanding this work is. It's, there's a cliche to say these things are a journey, but it's absolutely right. It's a multi-year. No one should expect within a year or even two to go from, if you like, being more bureaucratic or more traditional, if you like, to being mission driven. And I think I was very struck as we went through just how how many different complementary capabilities and techniques there are as we started to break those out into the different domains. And of course, they then almost multiply through. And if you have them in combination across the different domains we describe in the framework, you get this quite profound mentality shift of what is the kind of thing an organization is, how should you conceptualize the work you're trying to do? As Vinuri, as you put it, this sense of agitating change across a system or orchestrating change across a system, certainly with grand missions. It's quite a profoundly different way of conceptualizing what you're trying to do as a government from a traditional top-down program or project. So I suppose I was left by being sort of slightly in awe of what a big ask it is to be truly in that top right quadrant of being mission-driven. What did you change your mind about, Dan, as we went through? I wonder, maybe surface some of the kind of arguments and debates we had in the course of drafting the framework.
I remember us agreeing on all things. So I would say I changed my mind. I began somewhat allergic to the idea that we could put numbers on this, right? And also that we could use any scales, much less the same scales, to think about grand and organizational missions. And, I think if we if we treat those numbers as if they're, the end all be all of performance, I think we've still made an error, right? But the idea that self-assessment can help us codify how we're doing, if we think of it not as a kind of control tool, but as a kind of learning tool, right? Seeing where we are and where we aren't. I came to think that this is a really useful way to begin a conversation. And really it's that conversation inside your organization over that, as you, I think, rightly put it, James, multi-year process of organizational change, which is the real thing. And that this kind of method of evaluating and self-evaluating can really help people have productive conversations, which is a lot of what came back from our user feedback as well. So yeah, I think that's certainly something I changed my mind about over the course of our time.
And I think, one of the debates we had sort of quite early on was this, as Vinuri said, this question of does it make sense to articulate organizational missions as separate from but complementary to grand missions? And I think I changed my mind on that. I think initially was saying this is overcomplicates things. Can we just have this single concept and collapse it into this concept of being mission driven? I think I did change my mind on that, but partly for the reason of it's very important to be explicit that you have to be a purpose-driven organization with a very pronounced sense of its purpose that feels salient and is driving behavior and motivating your own staff before you can have a hope of projecting that change across the system. Maybe you can say a bit more, Dan and or Vinuri, on how those two relate. Really, how does the sort of purpose-driven management practices within an organization relate to that question of driving change across a system?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I guess to me, it comes back to this, what I was saying about uncertainty, right? So, if you're engaging in a grand mission, you're engaging in an attempt to change things at a scale and a scope that haven't been done before. And thus, you need staff and teams that have a clear mission in mind, right? And feel empowered and enabled to work in ways that allow them to be led by what they're seeing, by what they're experiencing, by the mission itself. And that is a question of employee motivation and orientation that is relatively well explored at the organizational level. And if you try making a new kind of vehicle with the same assembly line that was producing the same old Ford, I say as a Detroiter, right? So you're not going to do so well. To retool the assembly line means not just changing the rules at the top, it means changing how people engage in the craft of making it. And that means that you need a purpose-driven organization, you need mission-driven management, you need mission-driven bureaucrats and stakeholders from across the system to get to those grand missions too.
Yeah, Vinuri, any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think, and just to dovetail on what Dan mentioned, that there is this entire literature in kind of performance-driven and mission-driven management that we can leverage in the grand mission context. But we were, I think, initially hesitant to do that because grand missions seem so nebulous and so large that moving at it with any sense of granularity seems a little bit uncomfortable. But I think working through that discomfort actually showed us that we can, explore it in a domain relevant way. We can break apart these societal challenges and look at the kind of things and themes that are relevant across the different kinds of grand missions you can have and understand those domains in a similar way and the tools that can be, translated in those different domains. So I think moving past that resistance of feeling like you can be granular when something is so uncertain allowed us to connect these two different, discourses together, I think, in terms of organizational missions and grand missions.
And Isadora, I wonder if I can turn to you and sort of ground this a bit and maybe bring it to life. I know you've worked quite sort of hands-on with many organizations in your current role in the IIPP on becoming mission-driven, helping organizations transition. Maybe bring it to life for us. Are there sort of common patterns you've seen in the journey organizations go on, common pitfalls and lessons to learn?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. And this is a really interesting discussion so far. And there's so many things, I think, in that framework that almost just hearing you talk, I'm already changing my mind a little bit. I think I went in thinking that that distinction was perhaps artificial, but hearing you talk about it really brings it to life. So I do think there are examples right now, as Vinuri said, in the kind of gap between setting missions and doing missions. That's a really interesting place to be. And we're starting to see examples right now of missions driving real change. So from my experience, from the kind of mission setup phase, recently we worked with an organization who was trying to translate in the UK the national missions for their local context and embed them within their organization, which is an interesting way of approaching missions. And I think we can get into that. But the way they did this was convening a group of strategy and policy leads from within the organization and partners to act as an engine room to consider the infrastructure that they would need to actually drive the missions. And I think what made this successful is that there was a lot of senior buy-in that missions are complicated and there was going to be a need for a dedicated space to work this out. But there was also a lot of organizational baggage, of course, and everyone bringing their own kind of wounds around partner working, which exists in all kind of partnerships. What I think was really interesting in terms of the journey, though, was it started very much as a reaction to national policy, but the group of officers were really able to own it and change how the missions were reflected for their local context. They ended up adding a mission on housing and developing a set of principles and behaviors that they were going to work by and that they had identified as essential for driving the missions. And a lot of it mirrors what you were identifying in the framework. Things like situational and adaptive leadership and creativity and humility came through really strongly. So I think what's illustrative about that journey is kind of building missions from the middle out and leveraging the language of the national missions as a springboard. But another example that I come back to a lot, I think in this space, in these conversations, we often talk about Camden as an example of setting missions, but what I'm really interested now is the delivery of those missions. And I think at this particular moment, we're starting to see the kind of strategy to delivery thread, and that story is coming out much more fully. So for the audience, Camden set 4 missions, and it was very much a co-creation process with really strong political leadership, but also a lot of really in-depth resident engagement. And one of the missions is around improving economic opportunity for young people in the borough. And right now, service leads have a lot of discretion and autonomy to pursue mission-led projects. And one that I find really inspiring is this recent pilot project on direct cash transfers for pregnant people in the borough that's been delivered with the NHS. And the pilot is about to be evaluated, and I'm very excited to see how that is evaluated for the outcomes that are emerging. But to me, that's a great example of kind of service delivery in a mission-oriented way and trying something new and leveraging partnerships. And to me, those 2 examples kind of show 2 commonalities, which is missions have different starting points, and I think we can't be too prescriptive about getting missions 100% right or trying to do a perfect starting point. Some are starting from the top, some are starting from the middle, some are starting from the bottom. And something, Dan and Vinuri, I'd be really keen to hear from you is, who can drive a mission and what kind of your framework tells us about that. What do we need to drive missions forward in the context of political cycles and all of the kind of organizational inertia? And then the other point that's common, I think, is that there's a lot of related behaviors and capabilities that we may not be calling mission behaviors, but are adjacent. And there's a lot of really good work happening that we can kind of lift up and learn from. And to me, that's connected to IAPP's work on dynamic capabilities of the public sector and connected to your work. But I'm really encouraged by examples like OPSI in Liverpool, which is trying to do a test and learn approach to innovation and things like that that are kind of embodying some of this work, even if it's not explicitly called mission driven.
Right. Yeah. I was at a fantastic event yesterday in Oxford, part of the launch of the Test and Learn work and the expansion of that program that folk might know is being driven by the Cabinet Office, but very much it's a very system-wide approach to sort of bottom-up public service reform, and it feels like it shares a lot of the spirit of what we're talking about in mission-driven working, appreciating complexity, working iteratively close to a problem, mixed discipline teams. A lot of the operating models very similar. I wonder if you could just sort of unpack a bit more, Isadora, as well, kind of difficulties. I suppose it's hard, this stuff, and so are there common difficulties organizations, common mistakes that you see made, recurring patterns of what organizations find hardest in the first 2-3 years? Are you muted?
I'm muted, my goodness. I think there are commonalities, and people fall all over that matrix that you showed. This work is really hard. It's really messy. I think before even the first 2 or 3 years, it's really hard to get the level of ambition right so that it is credible and something that everyone in the organization can move forward with. Had experience working with an organization that initially wanted to set their missions for 2050, and then due to political and organizational kind of reality, moved to 2040 and then to 2035, and we're aligning it with political cycles. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the reality of this. And I think there is a shared challenge of holding on to the ambition of transformation while also working in a context where politics or government is about what is going to change for me tomorrow and what are you going to do for me now. So it's the kind of long-term ambition. And I think also collaboration is really, really hard. And organizations of any size and complexity kind of navigate this, and overcoming those barriers is really challenging. In one of the IIPP public sector capabilities reports, which references a lot of different city examples of this, they reference in South Africa, in Cape Town, that the city government instituted a stupid rule button, which was anytime someone came across a rule that was an unnecessary barrier, it went through a different process to someone senior to justify why that rule had to be in place or remove it. And I think that, things like that are great examples of, you don't have to call it a stupid rule button, but ways of kind of overcoming the small things that aren't actually that small that prevent us from collaborating on a more human level.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. I'll start bringing in some of the questions coming through in the chat. So maybe, Vanessa, you can pick up this one about who does the assessing. And I guess I'm particularly interested in the context of grand missions. I think we had some kind of assessors in mind. As you said, it's a self-assessment tool very much rather than the sort of policing, external policing mechanism. Maybe talk us through, who do you think should be using this tool? Who does the assessing in the context of organizational and grand missions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one we consistently revisited as we were iterating on the framework. I think in the organizational context, we thought of it as, and touching on a question that Isadora also mentioned around like who owns a mission. I think it comes to that as well. And when we came back to that question over and over again, we thought to ourselves, no, missions should not be exclusive. To actually change a system, your frontline worker needs to have just as much agency and sense of purpose in that mission as your executive leadership does. And so bridging that gap between those two levels of management and cultivating a shared sense of purpose, whether you're working on a grand mission or an organizational one, is absolutely critical. But in terms of who we see in a practical sense, kind of doing the self-assessment, we see it starting at the kind of leadership level, even at an organization or a lead organization in the grand mission context. And it could be in doing that self-assessment, they identify conversations they need to have happen at all different layers of the system or all different layers of the organization. And we also, in addition to creating that, self-assessment kind of perspective for leaders, we created the kind of people survey that can be administered in both contexts, in the organizational one and the grand mission one. And that was to ensure that we're not just hypothesizing as leadership that a behavior is occurring, because, you know, you can have that sense of bias that we are working well in a specific domain. Of course, our people are motivated and have a sense of mission point, but that might not be the case. So to actually put your ear to the ground and hear what your people and your organization or your system is saying, whether those are internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, allows you to see the other side of the coin and kind of test, you know, is everything you thought you've been doing actually working? You know, you're walking the walk. Are you actually talking the talk? And that litmus test is the one we keep coming back to in terms of being a self-assessment mechanism.
Yeah, and I think we talked, as we developed the framework, a lot about the who is the we, and I think increasingly I started to feel that this could be quite a useful conversation to have system-wide and organization-wide. As you say, certain aspects of the assessment have to be initiated at least by leadership, things like a staff survey. There are certain tools that only a leadership team could kind of put in place, some of the infrastructure for that, but at least making that an open conversation.
Yeah.
You know, does it ring true to people that you're strong in these domains and weak in these domains?
Exactly. And just to point a quick kind of delineation out, when we were developing in the organizational domains, what the kind of 360 view of all the levers we need to be looking at to actually create change, we were very intentional about separating people and leadership, because what a leadership can do in terms of the rituals and practices to create change might not be what people can do in the front lines. And so pulling the two out together, and we noticed there was a lot of overlap there, but we were determined to keep it separately because we wanted leadership and the conversations that they have to be really clear that while we are a part of the people, we need to think of their sentiments as being different to what we might house at the executive or upper management level. And that ensuring that lived experience is well represented is actually what's going to give us a clear line of sight as to whether mission-driven practices are cascading down your organization or down your system.
Right. I wonder if we can open up to another question that came through from Abigail on mission washing. And I think let's try to sort of be as specific as we can here without maybe naming names of actual organizations, but maybe to start with you, Dan, on this one. I guess just to kind of to bring to life and characterize, because I think this is common, organizations say the word missions and not much changes. So what does that look like? Why does that happen? Kind of maybe give us some examples of where you've seen that happening. Bring that to life for us.
Yeah, sure. So first, I don't think this is a problem unique to missions, right? So whatever terms are exciting people, either because they're in the mouths of, you know, senior leadership and politicians, or simply because they're kind of seen as a new approach and they're things that people are getting organically excited about. You know, it is very easy to hope to make change simply by using different language. But, you know, I think this leads to kind of like hype and collapse cycle that I've seen in multiple ways, right? So, you know, first we try widget. I'm not going to use the word mission for a second, right? We try widget. People get really excited about widget. Then they say, wait, we tried widget, nothing happened, so widget must not be useful. And I think I see the risk of missions going through this cycle. And so I can think of a specific organization where a senior leader in that organization, somebody running teams, you know, probably 1,000 people under this individual, said to me, look, you know, great news. We are managing in mission-oriented ways. And I said, fantastic, what are you doing? And the individual said, well, I have sent out a clear memo telling everyone they have to be mission-oriented. And I said, it's close. It's really, I love the spirit, right? But you're not going to be able to achieve this in this kind of top-down way. And in part, we see this framework as providing an opportunity to allow lots of different kinds of users to have some insight on whether, in fact, things are changing in a way that helps preserve and reinforce mission, right? So, you know, James, I disagree slightly, frankly, with something you said before, which is only leadership can do a people survey. Only leadership can do a mission-wide, or only a mission board or a lead organization could do a grand mission-wide people survey, right? But if you have a team of 12 people and you ask them anonymously a set of questions, and you ask them the same questions anonymously every 6 months or a year or 2 years or whatnot, now you're getting a sense of whether your team is changing. And your ability to say, if you're a true believer in this, that, hey, we're not changing, and I think some of the, to steal Isadora's stupid rule button, right? Or Cape Town's, as it were, so that some of what's happening is coming from above. That's part of what my team is reporting is getting in the way. Then we hope that this tool can help arm and begin a conversation that moves towards this. And the example I gave, I want to be clear here. The senior leader wasn't trying to just use the language. I think we can be a little bit cynical about mission washing and say, oh, it's always because it's the coin of the political realm and people trying to appeal to a kind of broader framework, frankly, particularly in the UK right now. I'm not saying that's impossible, but people who really want to make change can lack the vision of how to do it. And in part, one way to kind of get beyond mission washing is to give people the tools, the techniques to think about ways of working and ways of seeing if those changes in ways of working are in fact having an impact.
Right. I wonder if we can get into sort of politics and how politics plays into all of this. Isadora, one of the questions that came in before was in advance of the session was around the appetite. How much appetite really is there, do we think, in the UK for doing missions properly? How sort of broad and deep does that appetite run in the system? What's your sense of the honest answer to that?
I think the honest answer to that is that it would be foolish to ignore the national conversation around missions, and that has an effect on kind of the entire environment. But I also think the appetite to work in a more purpose-driven way has been there before this. And people have been working really hard in an incredibly challenging, in the UK, fiscal environment, and have been trying to find ways to be innovative and creative before missions were kind of on this other level. And I also think that there is, as I said before, a lot of practice that's been mission adjacent that can be kind of leveraged in this moment where missions maybe have a bit more attention. I think the risk that I see candidly is missions becoming a kind of lobbying tool or becoming a political tool rather than something that is about stimulating partnership and collaboration and real system change. I think it is kind of a mistake to view them only as a lever to kind of communicate with national government or, to open that door. But to me, there is a real appetite for change and a real excitement about doing things differently. I share Dan's kind of perspective on missions not being a thing that happens and then goes away because you don't immediately see something happening tomorrow. I think the challenge with missions is going to be holding strong in some ways while also being flexible and building in those opportunities, like in the Camden example, for starting a program that is delivering something different tomorrow while also holding a long-term, transformative vision.
Right. I mean, this came up yesterday in the discussion we were having around test and learn, as well as how do you help the politician essentially make the political argument that creates the environment for this kind of work to happen, and not just ignore. Sometimes there's this slight, the official slightly ignores some of the constraints that the politician is under or rolls their eyes at those constraints and vice versa. And somehow there needs to be some degree of shared sort of ownership of that problem. We have to both satisfy the sort of policy and delivery, get that right, and also have the political narrative that kind of works in the moment, I guess. Maybe we can get a bit deeper into some of the kind of craft of this, some of the questions coming through. So how about this one around purpose and missions and purpose? So David asked, or pointed out, we're using mission and purpose slightly interchangeably. I don't know if Finuri, you have views on this. Are there, maybe focus on the differences? What are the differences between mission and purpose in this context of this conversation?
Thank you, David, for that question. I think It's an interesting one because we are intentional about using it interchangeably, because we are borrowing kind of the language at the organizational level that many organizations sit with a purpose, but maybe they're not talking about it in the mission context or in using the language of missions. And so bridging that gap is intentional. And as Isadora mentioned, there's a lot of work that's happening mission adjacent that we're not really leveraging in the right kind of way. And so the example of using purpose in the same context as mission is kind of the same intent, really. In terms of what's different, I think purpose in the grand mission context can be quite vastly different. And, you know, when you're talking about these really complex societal challenges, you know, having a sense of purpose is not sufficient. You have to kind of disrupt the existing equilibrium of the system in order to create change. And so a well-meaning purpose does not actually kind of supersede having this grand mission that is about policy reform, that is about change, that is about bringing all the stakeholders in a system to believe in a brighter future for something. And so I think in the organizational one, it's a lot more interchangeable than in the grand mission context. That would kind of be my assessment. Dan, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. So I think so. I agree with everything you said on the grand mission side. I'm not as sure I see unity on the organizational side. And I guess what I'd say is, like, you know, an organization which seeks to build a bridge or build a road, right, and does through very prescriptive, high monitoring, high control kinds of ways, has a purpose, right? It's building that bridge or that road, but it's not operating in a kind of mission-oriented way in a managerial sense, right? There's no mission-oriented management there. The mission-oriented management comes in because we have a sense that people not just doing their individual things to task, but having kind of flexibilities and autonomies and empowerment is critical to having our organization achieve what we're looking for. And so, you know, grand missions are always on that kind of mission-oriented management side of things, because otherwise they wouldn't be grand missions. We wouldn't need a grand mission to get there. I think, you know, purpose can be emergent. Missions have to be what you're actually aiming towards. They have to be understood, not just come out of the system. That said, neither can be dictated. You know, they both, in some sense, come from the complex interaction of all the people, in the organization or working on the grand mission.
I do think just one thing it really brought home to me writing, particularly the grand missions, when we worked on that section, is this, I know, as you said, Vinuri, the kind of gap that opens up where purpose is by no means enough. And there is just a really significant set of capabilities and specific techniques and tools, right, to orchestrate change across the system. We talk about driving innovation a lot in the framework, for example. Tools like challenge prizes, different mechanisms that have been developed over the years to drive innovation in a mission-aligned way across a private sector economy, across civil society. So I do think in that context, the gap opens up even much wider. There's as you say, purpose is not enough is a good way to put it, I think.
Can I push a little bit on that?
Yeah.
With that distinction that you're making, does that suggest that there are like tiers of importance? Does it premise that grand missions are more important or for challenges that are more important and organizational missions are for challenges that are less important? Like, how would an organization approach, you know, having organizational missions and a grand mission, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. Are you coming in, Dan?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I'd love your thoughts on this too, James. I mean, I guess I would say organizational missions are for things we can solve at the organizational level, right? So, you know, the scope of the problem. So we're trying to provide social services to people in the county. We control the relevant levers. The question is, how do we deliver it differently? Grand missions are for things that go beyond the existing organizational structure and where we don't know the right answer, right? You know, where we're trying to figure out the right answer and we think the nature of the right answer we're not going to get with our existing tools and our existing knowledge, right? So, in the UK, those grand missions are set, are usually seen as those national missions, to the example you started with. But, in your hypothetical, an organization could say, here are things within our scope, here are things not within our scope. On the second, we're going to try to be the lead organization to a broader set of grand missions, right? Even beyond those being dictated at the national level. And so it's not importance, it's not welfare impact. It's kind of the nature of the information coordination problem, whether we have known technologies or not, what we think the managerial kinds of solutions and techniques we need to drive change is what I think.
Yeah, I think that's my way of thinking about the distinction as well. The one that always crystallizes this for me is around net zero and the distinction between, on the one hand, we will be a carbon neutral organization, we will be the greenest, whatever paper manufacturer or charity in this part of the sector, versus we will orchestrate a transition to a net zero economy, which is the kind of extreme example of a situation where we are stuck in a sticky equilibrium as an economy, and it requires this kind of profound system level change on multiple sectors across multiple domains simultaneously that can only be orchestrated by a government or a really significant organization. And that feels to me qualitatively different. You start to think differently about the tools and techniques required. I wonder if we can get a bit specific on some of these questions coming through. So one around permission to fail. This comes up a lot in the context of government. I don't know if Isadora, in your work with clients, you've seen this, but permission to fail feels like one of the most central cultural aspects of these are complex areas to work in. We have to learn as we go. How have you seen that play out? How do you best give people permission to fail in a bureaucracy in particular?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I think it gets to one of the biggest challenges that is live right now in doing this work. I think there are two critical aspects to it. One is around incentivizing and resourcing kind of failure in a different way, or giving people the time and space and baking this into your job. James, you gave the example earlier of challenge prizes, but things like sandboxes or kind of prototypes and pilots, building it into your job that you are going to do these things. And this is going to be kind of how we are working in a more dynamic way. But I think that is only possible if there is a level of risk that is held organizationally kind of at the top that enables people kind of on the front lines to work differently. And something I think a lot about is, as a resident, do I really want to feel like my council is going to fail or is going to do things that are really risky? Of course not. So it's also how I tell the story of this and how I engage people in, we're trying something different and we're not going to get everything right, but we're going to try a lot more things and it's going to be a lot quicker than what you're used to. And I think this gets back to the kind of officer-politician relationship that we were talking a little bit about earlier, kind of around the politics of all of this, of you need politicians to kind of hold the vision as well as a little bit of the risk, but you need to share that kind of with your chief exec, who is also going to do that. But yeah, would really welcome, Dan Vennuri, your thoughts on that kind of point around risk or burn rate as well.
Sure. I read you, Vennuri, have said, no, Dan, you take this one. So I will. I agree. I particularly agree in that positive framing, right? So, we're trying to do things differently because things aren't working, right? Maybe the dashboard has all green lights, but we know actually that the thing we're trying to accomplish is not going so perfectly. And thus, what we're trying to do is improve, right? And when we're going to try to improve, we're going to try a couple things out, and we're going to see which of those things work, and we're going to seek to learn as quickly as possible, right? But if the status quo were perfect, we wouldn't need this. What we're trying to do is figure out how to make things better. And in that sense, having a culture of failure, which is a culture of kind of, quit as rapid learning cycles as possible, feels to me critical to how we kind of build that possibility. I will also say this is a place, I have a slide somewhere where it's like it's a 4-step process. You say it's okay to fail, right? Your leadership in this case, I'm talking to a minister or somebody of that, or PermSec. You say it's okay to fail. What will happen? No one will believe you. No one will change their behavior, right? Someone will take a risk and try the kinds of behaviors you say it's okay to try now, right? You should celebrate them, right? Maybe some of those behaviors are going to work out great, right? People are not going to start behaving differently. This goes a little bit to Jingwen's question as well. People are not going to start behaving differently until some people take some risks, do some things differently. They work out imperfectly, and those people are celebrated for having taken the smart risks and made the smart bet, not just because the outcome of that risk was success. And only then, stage 4, are you going to see broader change in behaviors. And so you need to not just message that we're thinking differently about this and it's okay to fail and we can fail, but actually live that through a multi-step organizational process. And if you are not going to be able to survive the first negative impact or even bad headline, depending on what level you are not going to get that far. And I think being clear about that up front is an important part of the process.
And I would even add a 5th step to that, Dan, which is learning from failure. Like that we need to then have a way of building in how we're going to learn from, what went wrong and how we're going to change immediately. And I don't know, I think that's I like that journey that you just took us on. That's really great.
And just to add to that, I think one element of this is mission resilience. Believing in your mission at the leadership level, in your front lines, in your system, enough that when things do go wrong, you are resilient to the North Star and the lighthouse of what you're trying to achieve. I think that's absolutely critical. And in the organizational level, I think a really tactical way and a practical way to bring that to life is co-producing with your beneficiaries, bringing them into the conversation, taking them on the journey so that they can see the try, test, learn approach that you're working on. And that, being agile means that we get solutions to you faster and we get your experience to these solutions as well. At the the grand mission level, I think James said it perfectly, like grand missions are grand missions because they are sticky, right? That we need a way to kind of pull at that glue and see what springs back to know what other parts of this mission we need to pull at. And so I think knowing where resistance emerges and knowing where we can be resilient creates this kind of, trade-off in many ways to know where are the areas in which we should focus our energy and where are the areas in which there's enough belief in the system that we can push a little bit further.
I'm conscious of time, so I might squeeze in one final question. So Jingwen's question, which has been in the chat for a while, around the kind of trade-offs on financial performance and mission outcomes. I mean, I've seen Mariana Mazzucati talk very compellingly about this, of the sort of reject the zero-sum notion, and this is part of the kind of dynamic conception of missions, particularly obviously a growth mission or in the context of industrial strategy, right? That the envelope isn't fixed, and part of what you're trying to do in a mission is create these cycles that then grow the envelope and create capacity. I mean, it's challenging to kind of win that argument. Certainly colleagues in Treasury and others will have heard that kind of argument before, but Isadora, maybe having kind of worked in IIPP, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, I think that the work of IIPP is really informative on this, and there's a lot of leadership from Mariana and her work, as well as Rainer Cattell, on kind of how you take a more dynamic conceptualization of the role of the state, particularly in, environments of extreme fiscal constraint. And James, you're completely right. It's not zero sum. It's about a rethinking of public value and the kind of role of the state as kind of breaking out of this new public management, neoliberal economic orthodoxy to a much more kind of a different, bolder, braver version of the state. And yeah, I think that their kind of leadership on this and how tools like industrial strategy can drive kind of mission ways of working or a kind of bolder version of the state is really the kind of North Star for this type of thinking.
Great, thanks. A bolder, braver state feels like a good point to end on. So I hope Stephanie, you feel we slightly touched on your question. Joel, I think we may have missed yours. Apologies. I think we slightly ran out of time towards the end. But thanks for everyone's questions. Thanks all for a really thought-provoking discussion, as I knew it would be. We do have a short feedback survey. We're always keen to hear how we can improve these sessions, ideas for future topics and speakers. That should be posted in the chat if you can follow that link through and fill out the survey. There is, I think I'm right to say, a prize draw. So in the spirit of challenge prizes, you will be entered for a prize draw for a £50 bookshop voucher if you fill out that survey. So there's your incentive. And yes, so thanks so much everyone for your questions and for making that a really stimulating discussion. And do check out the framework. It is a long and detailed piece of work and hopefully is useful. It was very much conceived as a kind of version 1 as well. So we would be very open to feedback on, is it useful? How could it be improved over time? But thanks everyone for joining us today. Really stimulating discussion, and thanks to all our speakers.